Nice.
Good.
All right, let's get airborne on talking about the essence of winning and losing. There's a lot of
All
key
right.
points that you brought up in the last couple of weeks on Slightly East of New. We have the presentation. We'll definitely put that on the link of the
Thank
show
you.
notes and all that. But I think there's some critical aspects that we need to look at. One thing that I want to start off with was you talked about information and energy,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a currency that flows through the OODA loop.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get your thoughts on why you chose information and energy potentially as that currency.
Well, those are two that Boyd used, of course. He talks about, he's talking about entropy. He talks about Shannon's, theory of information. And of course, there's the standard um, um, interpretation of entropy as energy that's there but not available for doing work. And so what flows through the OODA loop, if you look, essentially, you think, well, it's just all information, but that's fine until you hit the outside world. Then you hit action,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why you can't interpret the OODA loop, purely as an internal, something going on inside your brain, because it's got that action and also the observe function. So that kind of flops over to the outside world. So you say, well, what about orientation? When you look at Boyd's definition of orientation, many-sided implicit cross-referencing process, projection, empathy, correlation, and rejection, then you start saying, well, what does he mean by projection? And it turns out what he basically means is trying stuff and seeing what's happening, or it's making predictions, trying them out, and then comparing that to what actually goes on. Sometimes you're predicting the effects of your own action, which is the main use for it. But other times you may just be predicting, gee, I wonder what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Now, as you know, Boyd doesn't like anything passive. So if he says, well, if you're going to wonder what he's going to do next, probe him and test him a little bit while you're at it, and that way you can better interpret what it is that he's doing. Otherwise, if you're not taking the initiative in this, then it's always possible for you to be deceived. You don't know what he's feeding you, what he wants you to see. Mm-hmm. so that you'll predict and carry out actions that he wants you to carry out. So.
Well, Chet, let's go through the brief if you don't mind. We'll put it up on the screen.
Sure.
Will you kind of walk us through it? We'll have a conversation about it.
Can we have one more bottom line up front?
Sure.
And this is imperative for the bad Boyd crowd. This is the only place where Boyd illustrated the OODA loop.
Yeah. Yes, the only one. Absolutely. Yeah, I remember the sketch that showed up in the mail one day. Sitting at Lockheed, minding my own business. And it was, yeah. Well, what John would do is he'd call you real quick and then hang up. And then once you call him, because Lockheed's died, it just gets tacked onto the cost of the F-22.
I don't think many of our listeners understand what you just said about having somebody call you and you calling them back. That's
yeah. Anybody below the age of 40.
They just don't understand. It costs money to make long distance phone calls back in the good old days. And Boyd didn't have a lot of it, being a retired colonel, about his only source of income. And so if he could offload some of those costs, and since that we were using a lot of that stuff in the work I was doing for Lockheed, I figured, well, it's got to be reasonable. My boss went along with it, so that's the way it is. And I don't know how Lockheed accounted for it. Nobody ever said anything, so that was that.
There you go.
Okay, so the question is that people doing a lot of stuff out there with OODA loops, and all in all, I think that's good. They, with the exception of one guy, they tend to take what Boyd did and make it even more complex. But be that as it may, to account for things that they see. And so I thought it might be useful to everybody to go back to the beginning and say, I never heard of where did the OODA loop come from? What problem was it supposed to be solving? And another point, which I didn't bring out in this briefing, but I do plan to address somewhere, is, and why at this stage of his life did Boyd feel impelled to actually draw the OODA loop sketch? Why did he went all these years without having a sketch of the OODA loop? And I know for a long time he just, he talked about that circular sort of thing. And I've asked Chuck Spinney about this, and Chuck said, well, I tried to discourage him actually from drawing it because I knew whatever he drew would take on some kind of dogmatic flavors that people will be putting it up on the heads-up display. I said, I don't know. don't think that. But anyway, that is that people would start to forget the sketch part on the end and say this is the OODA loop. Fortunately, I don't think that's happened. People are continuing to experiment, continue to work and play with it, and I think do the kind of things that Boyd would probably be doing if he were here. But I think two things happened that impelled it. The first is he was really in the late 1980s, starting about 87, 88 or so. He was getting very heavy into this Japanese stuff. He had been Sun Tzu ever since the very beginning. But after he finished Patterns of Conflict, he ran across The Japanese Art of War by Thomas Cleary, which introduced him to a whole bunch of different stuff, different people primarily from the samurai period. So he was familiar with Miyamoto Musashi, of course, from Book of Five Rings, but there were several other people in there that Cleary went into in great detail. Zen Master Takuan, for example, Yagyu Munenori, just to name a couple. And people that are into this sort of thing will know these names. And people that are not, they're just people from the early to mid 1600s, the height of the samurai period in Japan. And they were emphasizing over and over and over again that actions have to flow. And they don't, of course, use the term orientation, but that's clearly what they were taught based on your previous experience and your training and all this kind of good stuff. There wasn't enough time in the kind of combat they were doing to stop and explicitly think. Mm-hmm. You know, as Rumsfeld said, you fight with the army that you have. Of course, he was responsible for the army that we had, SecDef at the time, but we won't go into that. Anyway, so that got him thinking more and more. Now, he had, about that time, at 1987, started to go much more into implicit. Of course, a lot of that was what he got from the Germans. And he actually talked about, emphasized implicit over explicit to gain an advantage in time and that sort of thing. And he was realizing it's really hard to do with the circular sort of process. It's actions just don't flow from anything in that process. It's, they move in discrete chunks. And so I think that kind of got his mind going. Then he did Conceptual Spiral, where he said, well, it's clear that there is some circular stuff going on. And in Conceptual Spiral, he comes to practice of science and the practice of technology, where you try things out and you learn from the results. And you have to be very explicit, particularly in the practice of science. You have to have a testable hypothesis. And it's got to withstand academic scrutiny. And, writing hypothesis is a real challenge because it's written in the English language and things can be interpreted various different ways. And a lot of the criticism of almost any scientific paper goes back into how they set up their experiments. Almost nobody argues, once you get it set up, how you do the math, that's pretty straightforward. And you come up with a p-value, and if it's less than 0.05, statistical kind of stuff. And that was fine, but again, that's not. And thinking back on it, that's not how you do conflict in real time against a thinking opponent. There's just not enough time for it. It's not to say that you don't, as you're doing this stuff, and even in sword fighting, and even Boyd, as he was doing his airplane stuff, as he was doing it, he was learning from it. But it was all implicit. It was out of going past the prefrontal cortex back and somewhere in the rest of his brain to be thought about later when had a little more time. People weren't shooting at him.
So Chet, I was wondering if you could kind of take us through implicit guidance control through your world of yoga, of practice, and kind of step away from conflict now, because I think a lot of people look at conflict and go, I want to stay away from this. Can you give us a practical application of implicit guidance control through your work in yoga?
It turns out that I cannot.
No?
And
okay.
The reason is very interesting. The word implicit implies groups. You don't need to be implicit with yourself. Okay. The opposite of implicit is explicit. And unless you talk to yourself a lot, you write down notes for yourself and look them up virtually. When we're talking about people, you're typically using the term intuitive. It kind of tends to have that. In fact, Boyd talked about that. He said, if you think about groups as being organisms, like they work together long enough, train together, fight together, live together, they sort of, if you look down from the top, it's sort of beginning to look like an organism now. And he said, if you think about an organism that has Einheit, has this kind of thing, to an outside observer, it would look like that the organism itself has Fingerspitzengefühl. In other words, it looks like the organism is just responding intuitively. When of course there's actually a lot of stuff going on between people and all that. So, but he used the term implicit guidance and control, and I think in that OODA loop he never really decided whether it was for people or for groups. So what goes on inside the orientation box is pretty much individual stuff. And if you include genetic heritage in there, unless you want to get yourself in some real trouble nowadays, it's kind of all individual. And so that gets into the make intuitive within ourselves right there, is talking about individual, those many practices. So you go back to yoga for that, or any skill that you learn. When you first start doing it, it's very rough. Right. You have to stop and think, and you try things, you fall over a lot, you hurt yourself sometimes because you go down too deep. But once you get past that point to where the mechanics of it are imprinted on you in your quote a muscle memory, as you say. So you can go into a position, know how far down to go. You can use your breath to feel the energy as you're, for example, if you're in warrior pose, those are pretty intensive poses. If you're warrior 2, you have your arms out, you're imagining energy coming up from your core and flowing out your arms. And as you exhale, then you're bending your knees a little bit more, you're opening a groin area a little more, and you're sinking down just simply. You're not pushing yourself. And it's that ability to do that. You go through that cycle of breathe and extend and exhale and relax and go down, and it's that Chi Ching sort of stuff all going on, and that's kind of that's what distinguishes yoga from calisthenics.
But the practice, the deliberate practice of doing those things builds your intuition, your implicit guidance control, your autonomic response, your skills.
That's the idea, yes. And it's on various different levels. First, you have to have the response. Then you've got to have it wired into your orientation, so that in this situation, that response is what gets offered up. I hate to say triggered, because then it sounds like a reflex. Reflexes exist, but that's not what we're talking about here. Because your brain is actively engaged. It's sort of like all of a sudden your brain knows what to do, and you do it. You're watching your proponents reacting what you're doing, so you sort of know what to do on the next time. And you're learning from your opponent, so that if it keeps that saying, you don't try the same thing again, sort of thing. Which is how you can tell if it's not reflex, because you should never do the same maneuver twice in a row unless it's part of a deception, sort of. Of course, with deception, you can do anything that deceives. Anything at all, if you can figure out what that is. So what Boyd said is that this implicit repertoire. Now, when we talk about implicit, now he kind of blurs the thing. For a long time, I thought he didn't know the difference between implicit and intuitive, but as many people have pointed out, he was very, 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 very careful with words. And so I think when he gets into this area here, he's talking about teams, organizations, groups of people, because that's really what patterns of conflict is all about. We say Einheit is fundamental, and all that. But if you're just talking about an individual, unless you're schizophrenic and you have Einheit among your various personalities, it doesn't make any sense. I'm being facetious here, but you know what I mean. Yeah. But among individuals, that unity, that oneness, that mutual trust, common sense of shared purpose, that sort of thing. Ability to read minds, as the Marine Corps talks about it, is fundamental before you go on to anything else. Yeah. So go ahead.
So I want to try something here. As we're talking about organizations and teams, and going back to some of the practices you brought up from yoga, the idea here is in order to build a team or teaming skills, the process of teamwork, right. You have to learn, practice, and it has to be reinforced by the system. So this is something that the military, aviation, SEALs, our submarine community does quite well, is we actually deliberately train people how to work together as a team. And this way, when the team operates, their OODA loop, it bypasses the decision-making, the hypothesis on how to work together as a team. So think about non-technical skills, is they're kind of inherent within the individual, and collectively the team becomes a self-organization or self-organizing entity that emerges into something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that,
Absolutely.
right. And this is important for our listeners out there. When we talk about building teaming skills within your team's OODA loop, or your team of teams, multiple OODA loops, or your organizational OODA loops, you have to focus on developing implicit guidance control, or that implicit repertoire of how to work together as a team. This is fundamental to what all high performing teams do. They do this quite well. And I'm using this as an opportunity because I think this is important when we try to communicate this as the OODA loop as an organization, as a team. That's what we're trying to do. At the individual level, we're looking at intuition, autonomic response, mental models. Like, there's many ways to call it, muscle memory, all these other things. We're trying to bypass, and I'm going to go back to something you brought up earlier about flow and prediction. We're trying to bypass the higher energy approach to dealing with the external world, which is going through the pathway that goes from orient to decide, on through act, or back through observation. Those are predictions, by the way. Most of the predictions are actions. So if you can bypass that, you now have access to novelty in the external world. Why is that? And we talked about this with Chet and others before. Using the brain, and I don't like using the OODA loop as a brain, by the way, but using that as an analogy, 2% of our body weight's burning 20% of our energy, right? Or 25% of our energy. That's a very expensive organ. So we need to reduce the energy spend by building these skills up. And that allows us to get into a flow state. A flow state is really about risk and novelty, being present, going back to yoga and the things that you know. So it's not, what Chet, I believe, is saying is you can apply this to both the organization, the team level, the organizational level, or a cell. Just remember that the words mean things as we do that, right? And so don't, for the academics out there that get upset when we talk about the connection to the free energy principle and predictive processing and Bayesian inference. Yeah, it's all in there. However, this simple sketch that's in the essence of winning and losing is an abstraction of how, in my view, all living systems perceive, sense, act, plan, adapt, and learn. And if you get this, you can build an organization, you can build these amazing skills that allow you to achieve a flow state, whether it's in yoga, whether it's in team sports. We're going through March Madness right now. You're going to see a lot of things.
I was going to say basketball and soccer are two wonderful examples of it.
Yeah. So Chet, I just want to thank you for that. Can you build on that some more, or any more input on?
Boyd talks a little bit about that in Organic Design, where he talks about you build this state that you were just talking about by experience of working together in your team in situations of more and more complexity, more and more threat. So you think about, kind of your first days. I don't know. I went through Army ROTC, and they'd get us out. We'd do patrolling, and it was so funny. The first few that we did, I mean, Girl Scout troop could have easily wiped us out. But after a while, you learn to read each other. You learn, who you could depend on in these various situations. And you began then to function as a team through this shared experiences that you had under increasing conditions of threat and complexity. So if you go back over here to where we get implicit repertoire from, you notice there's already some here. Genetic heritage, we talked about among individuals. But if you look at cultural traditions really talk more about groups of people. If you're talking about individuals and how the cultural traditions affect them, you can drop that down into previous experiences. But what Boyd says, if you have people, and he doesn't make any claim here that the culture should be uniform. You should take everybody from the same monoculture, or whether, like Mike Wiley said, you should have as much cultural variation as you can stand, so long as you work together to build it into the state that you just talked about, so that when you get through, it doesn't look so much like a tomato bisque, everything nice and uniform. It's all been whirred together until it looks uniform, but much more like minestrone or something. In other words, it's there, it's a unified thing, but the individual parts have not been completely erased. People still bring their individual skills into it, but it's harmonized now so that it all from a higher level, it all works together. So it's not collections of robots, as Boyd has sometimes been criticize that, at all, because he never says anywhere in there that you try to erase these things over here. So it's not like they sometimes talk about basic training and tear the person completely down, to the bare skin and bones, and then build them back up. That's basic training is basically working on the individual. I mean, that's 90% of what they do. They do a little bit. And I'm thinking I'm more familiar with Marine Corps basic training here. I'd say 90% of what they do is all individual kind of stuff. And then they go on, once they leave Paris Island, then they go on to the School of Infantry, where they really start putting it together to how to work as a team. And depending on how long they stay there depends on whether they're going into infantry or whether they're going to go up to some other skill. Because as you know, every Marine isn't a rifleman. And I think that's good. I mean, I think that's the way it should be. But anyway, so you see over here, there's all kind of stuff going on as you poke into it deeper. So if we kind of let genetic heritage sort of fade in the background and think about just on teams here, you can see you take what you got, your previous experience as an individual, and then you add to that their previous experiences of working together as a team. Mm-hmm. And the Schwerpunkt is, as you said, allowing it so that they seem to function as a very opportunistic organism. If they were looked at from 30,000 feet and all you saw was just the organism, a very nasty amoeba.
So I want to take this down to the individual level, and I want to check in with Mark on something he's familiar, or we're all familiar with. So genetic heritage could be something like the DNA, our biology, how we're designed as humans,
epigenetics, whatever.
Epigenetics, all that stuff. Cultural traditions, what we've been looking at, and this is kind of a mystery, and I'm actually very glad John Boyd put this in orientation. It could be, the language we use, the symbols we use, numbers, things like that. That's part
Absolutely.
of our culture, and it varies throughout the world. And going back to your tomato bisque analogy, we don't want in my view, we don't want a homogenous world. We want a diverse world, the best we can make. And the same thing is true on a team. You want a cognitively diverse team. In fact, when you talk about instability of teams, or I'm going to use teams that are highly maneuverable or highly agile, are the most unstable, meaning they are the most dynamically or cognitively diverse group of people that have something that bind them together, which includes Einheit, and which includes the teaming skills.
Right.
And it's just like an F-18 or an advanced aircraft. It's stable flight. A lot of parts are moving on it all the time, right, to keep it stable. But that gives it agility, and John Boyd identified that with EM theory early on. So culture has a lot. We got to dive deeper in that on the show for sure, Moose. And the previous experience, we have a lot of that. But Moose, over to you. We've talked a lot about autism and things like ADHD. Any thoughts on orientation at the individual level?
Yeah, well, to ease into that, I think what Chet has pointed out is that something that we talk a lot with people is that orientation is fractal. I have one, a team has one, and OODA Loop Sketch helps support that. I think that from the individual level, I can think of like how my own cultural traditions as a, kid that grew up an Army brat, son of a West Pointer, went to high school in Pittsburgh, was a Marine officer, Irish Catholic, you could go down, and those definitely have an effect on me and who I am and what makes up me. I do understand what Chet is again pointing out, that it's fractal to the point where that affects a team and an individual, where implicit, there might be some back and forth on the word implicit or intuitive, but I do believe that a lot of those things that make up me definitely certainly control how I observe and sense make. And I think that when people get that, I mean, that's really the value of it's the weakness of Bad Boyd, right? Which is pervasive, showing them that if you don't consider these things or think about these things, then you're not really going to understand what's actually going on. I don't think that you have any way to align with reality. For what it is. And I think like you mentioned autism, what I'm learning about autism daily is that they tend to see the world for what it actually is, and they're not negatively influenced by culture or convention or anything. They see what's actually there and what actually is. Now there's a downside to that too. They don't have necessarily, like children that don't speak sometimes don't have a sense of danger, which can be scary. but they actually seem to me anyway, my impression is they see the world for what it actually is. So in other words, they have as an individual, I think they have a massive orientation advantage in that respect. Almost like a superpower. I mean, we've talked about that, you know, a lot of neurodiversity, neurodivergent. We even asked Mary. I mean, Mary told us about her dad, you know, John Boyd, that was the term punch. I think it was undiagnosed Asperger's.
Yeah. But the point
Could
here
well
is
be.
we all see it's fractal. We see the world differently based off of these. We'll call it a triad for now: genetics, culture, previous experience, and again, going back to Chet's point, using genetics inside of a team organization perspective is probably not the right choice of words, because you know that's more geared towards the individual level. So maybe we'll find in the future another term to use for team orientation, and I think
it doesn't have. Yeah, it doesn't have to be anything, you know, really negative, in the sense that if you have an infantry, let's say an infantry platoon, some people are going to be better shots than others. They're going to have better eyesight. They're going to have better. That's the person that you want out on, you know, guarding the perimeter at night. You know, to make your sniper. Other people are going to have faster reflexes. You know, that's the person you want on point, better hearing, all that kind of stuff. So you use the skills that you have in the best way to improve the overall team performance. So,
do you think that, like, let's just use the Force Design 2030 debate as an example? Do you think that the genetic heritage, the cultural traditions, and the previous experiences of the Marine Corps and their sort of collective orientation, that's why a lot of people are having a real grade against it, or a rub against it?
That could well be.
Yeah.
That could well be. Just been. I don't know. I really haven't studied 2030. I'm not being a Marine, but I'll let the Marines fight that out among themselves. But
right. So Boyd also gave us inside orientation, analysis, synthesis, and of course, new information, which I want to go dive into with you, Chet, because this goes into that. But after, once we have this triad, we'll call it genetic heritage, cultural traditions, previous experience. These things can enable implicit repertoire. They build through deliberate work, through doing the hard work. You create the repertoire.
Necessary, but a lot of other stuff that's got to be done to build it. Anyway.
So take us through what you ended up building out here with your.
The next statement he's working towards. You're going to need to make new implicit repertoire. Some of it is on the fly, and other is when you have time to, as we say in the military, revise your doctrine and train for it. But the question is of the infinitely many practices that you could put into your implicit repertoire. How do you choose which ones you actually are going to work on? Because it takes, as we talked about here, it takes some effort to stick these things in your implicit repertoire. It's great to talk about your platoon being able to do certain things, but if when they hit the ground, the lead starts to fly, they just go to pieces. Then those actions are not in your implicit repertoire. If you saw the movie We Were Soldiers, based on Hal Moore's book, of course, he talks about when they hit landing zone X-ray. Shortly after that, one of the platoon leaders decided to take the initiative, ordinarily a good thing, and ran out and got himself caught in an ambush in a big trap and got himself pinned down by basically misunderstanding the orders that Hal Moore was, had given him. So that was, and the reason that happened, of course, was, I should go back here. It wasn't that these people were necessarily stupid. It's just before they deployed, a whole bunch of the people he had trained got pulled out of the unit because their enlistments were up, and the new people that were in, they hadn't had time to develop this climate that we just talked about. So, if you're an organization, and you only have so many hours in the day, how do you decide which element you're going to add to your implicit repertoire? Things that you can, again, going back to infantry, just a wave of the hand or a whistle or a point or something like that will make happen what you want to happen, as opposed to having to sit down and write out, detail orders, which is just not time to do. And so you go through the process of analysis and synthesis, sports that is necessary. You got to think about what it is you're trying to do. You got to come up with some ideas, and then you got to try them out. And as you do those things, and you do them over and over and over again with your group, and I have to say it again, under conditions of increasing complexity, uncertainty, and maybe even menace, then you can add these things into your implicit repertoire. But without some thought about what it is you're going to add, the process just doesn't work. So we have entire commands, in the military, training and doctrine command, TRADOC, in the Army, and that sort of thing.
So Chet, hey, on this, can you walk us through how simulation works in building implicit repertoire, if you've thought about that at all?
Well, it's a technique. Obviously, you can use any technique that you want, and certainly modeling and simulation says, okay, given that I believe A, B, C, D, and E, what are the implications of that? You construct a model that best that you can models that situation. Then you run that model by plugging in different, y'all are familiar with it, but you still got to get out into the, and eventually and test it out. That's one of the big things of Boyd's whole thing. Until something is tested in reality, it's still a hypothesis.
Right.
Still in a hypothesis thing. Still got to go through tests, come back through observation and orientation, and by going through, and that is a real loop, going through that learning loop enough times, then you get to where you can now use the implicit guidance and control link across the top to trigger those, and so that's that is one tool. It's not a bad tool at all. I started my career modeling and simulation, and if you have things that are explicit enough to where you can create models, then it's not a bad technique at all to use.
So my view is Boyd actually put that pathway in the OODA loop. So when you look at Chuck Spinney's work and how he started to put a boundary around things, if you put a boundary around the OODA loop and you leave the action step or unfolding circumstance with the external environment out there, that internal pathway is a simulation. So if you think about it, when you make a decision to act, and we're going to, hey, either turn our head or look at something or move our arm. Before we do that, we actually run that simulation in our head to reduce what they call expected free energy, risk, uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right. So that's already happening. And again, going back to what Mark brought up earlier about it's a fractal. You brought it up to a larger organization that when you're inside an organization, sometimes you run model and simulations to see, because that's probably a smarter thing to do than actually go take action on the world to get, how am I going to say this so I don't get in trouble here? Some organizations like to take action on the world without thinking through it, right? And that's sometimes a bad
been
thing.
known to happen, yes.
Yeah. So again, my point there is, my view is within the OODA loop, Boyd gave us a policy, simulation, course of action, planning pathway, which moves from act back to observe, but remember, it also goes through decide. So that is very aligned to how the latest and greatest in neuroscience says our brains work, which is
that's
fantastic.
What I understand.
Yeah. And Boyd was on that same path, right? And that's where we're going with
really
this.
Amazing.
Yeah. And this, I want to go back to what Mark brought up early again. When you talk about bad OODA, and a lot, not you, Chet, but when people do, they're missing out on so much amazing work that John Boyd did. And I would say the majority of us, including Mark and myself, we do not understand yet, right? We're still trying to figure it out. He was that far advanced in this thinking because this is what he did. And you were there when he did this. So again, I just want to point that out to our listeners that when we dive into this, when you ask us to show you what the OODA loop means in 20 minutes, that's almost impossible, right? It's
true.
almost, it's like you asking me to explain the free energy principle in 5 minutes. I'm like, I'm going to give you the sketch of the OODA loop and that's it. That's how I'm going to explain the free energy principle to you, because it's the same, right? That's the best explanation of it. So I'm sorry about that. But the point again is Boyd's sketch captured many of the ideas that are emerging today from neuroscience, and which is amazing.
I believe that's true. It is. Because these ideas were just beginning to perk up when Boyd, died. There's still a lot of people thinking that, the brain you have at age whatever another is the brain you're going to have the rest of your life, and cells die off, and that's it. We're finding that's not true at all. The brain rewires itself and rebuilds itself constantly, and So anyway, with all that in mind, so the question is that how do you do analysis and synthesis? Where do you get the material, either for your mental models inside your brain? And I think what you said there is exactly correct as far as we know. And it certainly fits with Boyd's thing, is that it's as if in any situation, your brain kind of in the background is running gadzooks of models. And it's running them more probably as an analog computer than as a digital, but it didn't really make, and it's almost as if you have a little meter in front that says good or bad. And as you're running these models, that meter is going back and off. And when it gets one that's kind of acceptable, then that's what you do. And then you go on to the next one. And so you have to, but you have to train yourself to do that. And on chart 45 of Strategic Game, he kind of, it's a strange, hardly anybody pays any attention to this chart, but it's really the heart of everything Boyd does, including what we're talking about here. He says we can't just look at our own personal experiences or use the same mental recipes over and over again. So that begs the question, if we're not going to use the same ones, then where do the new ones come from? Well, he tells you, we've got to look at other disciplines and activities and relate or connect them to what we know from our experiences and the strategic world that we're living in. So we got to keep sucking in stuff from the outside. If we can do this, then here's the key thing, and he actually highlights it. We will be able to surface new repertoires, and I'm going to leave the next word out, develop Fingerspitzengefühl for folding our adversaries back inside themselves, morally, mentally, and physically, so that they can neither appreciate nor cope with what's happening without suffering the same fate ourselves. In other words, develop Fingerspitzengefühl. Well, what is Fingerspitzengefühl? Well, for an individual, it's that intuitive, what we were just talking about. For a group, it gets that implicit idea going. It's stuff that we can execute in response to influence a changing situation as intuitive, as implicitly as possible. So he said, all right, so to do that now, if that's where we're going here, if those are the actions that we're really trying to develop, those actions that allow us to fold the enemy and to develop Fingerspitzengefühl, which is an individual thing for folding the enemy back inside themselves, that's where we're going. Then we need this thing over here in the orange box to feed that process. And so what Boyd did was, as you can see here, he took some of the pieces he was already working with and he started playing with them. You guys have seen all of the chicken scratching and all of the stuff that he did to arrive at this point, pages and pages. We're only seeing really the finished product. Those drawings that he left us are actually very clean, which makes you think that there was a lot of stuff going on in the background over there that he just tossed it when he was through with it. Because I've been with John when John was really working this stuff heavily. It was just chaos, It was just, he was trying all kinds of stuff, but as it started to crystallize, then he started making these drawings, which they were easier to interpret if you knew what all of the symbols meant. And as you know, we're still trying to figure out what they all meant. So, but anyway, other than that small thing, iteration after iteration after iteration. And as he was doing that, he was putting pieces into a structure. And I've got a little bit of it here. So he took the implicit repertoire, the implicit guidance and control stuff. He took some of the three stuff over on the left, and he stuck them into orientation. He took analysis and synthesis. And it's really odd. He stuck analysis and synthesis into orientation, even though in the figure itself, the orientation looking process in the mustard colored chart just enables analysis and synthesis. Now he's taken analysis and synthesis and moved it down into orientation itself. And after a while, it just seemed to fit better that way, I think is what he's talking about there. But how analysis and synthesis affects our cultural traditions and genetic heritage, yet to be explained. So epigenetics may be in that group, but anyway. So that's what you see here. That this is supposed to illustrate all of that experimenting and prototype snowmobile that he was building that we see in the sketches that he left us at Quantico.
In the chart or slide 45 of the Strategic Game, the title at the top, what's the point of all this, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then inside there's a block that's highlighted.
Yeah, we will be able to. Well, so what he's saying is we have to look at other disciplines and activities and relate or connect them to what we know from our experiences in the strategic world we live in. If we can do this, and then the box, right, we will be able to surface the new repertoires. Yeah,
that is where the many-sided implicit cross-referencing process comes in. Is that you're saying that's the process that you use to go to these other disciplines and activities and relate and connect them to what we already have. But he keeps building on it.
So I think of the fallacy of the specialist, right? But I also think too that's right there, that slide on 45, the compounds this is like, if you're just studying simple linear roundabout OODA, you're absolutely screwed if your competitors are learning it this way.
You'll be digging yourself a deeper and deeper ditch or groove, as Tom Peters once called it, the deep groove. Yeah, you've got to be very good at what you do, but you've also got to be able to do this other stuff too. And whoever can balance that sort of contradiction the best is going to have an advantage. They'll be able to have the advantages of specialization, but also have the advantages of agility to develop this Fingerspitzengefühl for folding opponents. Because that's the ultimate Schwerpunkt, is that Fingerspitzengefühl for folding opponents back inside themselves. That's really what you want. Once you get that, then chart 132 from Patterns of Conflict, everything else sort of follows from that. Except for grand strategy. Remember, all the stuff we're talking about now is down at the conflict level. There's a level above that Boyd called the grand strategy and the national goal, and that's the constructive part. But we're not going to go into that here. Yeah. That's a subject for another day. So what Boyd did was he had this definition of orientation back from 1987. He'd actually been working on for a while. I wasn't there when he was doing a lot of this stuff here. I'd already moved to Atlanta in '83 and didn't get back to Washington that often. So I'm not exactly sure how he came up with these four things, but I do know a little bit about what he meant for them, and it's where the orientation now goes out and does the things that he's talking about on slide 45 of Strategic Game.
So say again, slide 132 of Patterns of Conflict.
Second impression, it's called, and that's the only place that he almost defines what it means to operate inside the OODA loop.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he just takes it as an undefined term, almost axiomatic term. But and it's interesting because he uses the term inside the OODA loop again in Essence of Winning and Losing, without explaining how you actually get inside that figure that he draws, 2 pages later, which it looks like if you ever got inside, it'd be like a maze, you'd never get out. But I don't know. It's something else for people to work on. But projections is clearly taking what we predict is going to happen and comparing it with what actually does happen. Projecting, as we were talking, your mental models are doing all this stuff. They're actually projecting out, if I do this, if I do that, if I do this, if I do that, extremely fast. And trying to portray, well, what can the enemy do? That sort of thing. And then you got your good meter, and once it gets good enough, then you go on to, and then go on to the next one. See what effect that had on it, sort of thing. So that's projections.
Yeah, that's very aligned to predictive processing, Bayesian inference, and what's being.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And so when you wrote this, and I saw that you put projections or the actions involve the action. Remember, we talked about actions being simulations and the action with the external world.
Yes.
So you're getting feedback from the external world, right? And this is the whole point of in a complex environment, you have to probe, and the way you probe is you have to take an action to get feedback from the environment.
Probe and test. Exactly. Not to say you can't pick up some stuff passively. Open source stuff, but you have to be very careful with it, because now you're in a sense getting what your opponent wants you to see. Even if you go and try to pry it out of him, that's why counterintelligence is such an interesting field. You never know what the guy is telling you is really what the truth is, or maybe he's a double agent and he's not unknown, telling you what the other side wants you to know. Now empathy is interesting. Why empathy? This gets back to the group again. You don't need empathy inside yourself. You need empathy when you're dealing with other human beings. And so what he's talking about here is not so much the practice of science and technology, but the practice of leadership and strategy within groups. And so you're sensing not only what's going on with the enemy, you also want to feel with your own team, feel what's going on with the opponent, and then compare those two. And there's a very interesting example of that in von Manstein's book, Lost Victories, where he's talking about the German entry into the Crimean Peninsula. If you look at the geography of that, the entrance to the Crimean Peninsula, a lot of lakes, very, very marshy ground that you have to go through, and it channelizes the attack. It means that the room for maneuver was very limited, virtually non-existent. It became a slugging match between the Germans and the Soviet forces on the other side. And it was really, really tough. They were taking lots of losses on both sides. And what he wanted to know was he wanted to feel which side was going to break first. And that's where that empathy came in. I mean, he had the lines on the map and he knew they were losing, and he had the estimates of what the Soviets were losing and all. But what do you want? So he actually went down to the front where he could try to feel some of the stuff for himself. Prisoners that had just been taken in, see how his own people look, look in their eyes, all that kind of stuff. My father fought in World War II on Bataan, and he said, well, the difference between a war movie and a war documentary is just look in their eyes.
No.
What wasn't Punch when we had Jim Gimian on talking about rules of victory? Wasn't empathy for your adversary? That was one of the. Wasn't that one of the things that came out of Sun Tzu?
It might be interpreted that way.
Yeah.
Think about Sun Tzu, a 2,500-year-old Chinese.
Well, another one would be from TPS, Toy Production System Ono, and Shingo would be Gemba. Go to the Gemba, right? Go see.
Yep. Go see for yourself. Go and see for yourself.
Genchi
but you got to
Genbetsu.
understand. Genchi Genbetsu, but you got to then understand what it is that you're seeing. I'm talking about one company I worked for. They'd take the CEO down to the factory floor. He'd stand there with a big grin on his face. Not a clue. It came from finance. It was maybe transferred to another company. Not a clue of what he was seeing. So that did not meet Genchi Genbutsu. Okay.
So I want to go into the fifth component of orientation, and this is a great. What I'm looking at right now is from 1987, how Boyd defined orientation, which included unfolding circumstances. And this is important because he changed that to add to be new information, right? So and let me just give you some background on this. New information is surprise. It's a surprise and information that's coming from the external world, what our sensory organs pick up, right? Because we don't get all the sensory.
You can think of a line from it going straight into observation if you want. In fact, Boyd, I think actually thought about sticking observation in new, but then he wanted a separate observation process for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, and then you go back to that question I asked you about information and energy. This is the currency that's flowing through the system, through the flow system.
Yes.
So now that fifth element inside of orientation, new information, the way we talk about it is sensory signals, the signals from the external world, and that carries a currency. Right. So, but to me, when I read this, unfolding circumstances could be that new information as well. I want to get your thoughts on why you think Boyd shifted from the 1987 definition to what's now in the orientation circle.
The only thing I can say is if circumstances may well be unfolding, but you don't pick it up. So you don't understand what's actually going on.
Say that again. This is critical, Chet.
This is just my guess, but the guess is the unfolding circumstances are out there, but all you see is what you sense, and that's the purpose of that briefing that I reposted just before that. Your brain lives in the dark in its own little world, and it's fed by senses. So that unfolding circumstances are out there, but until they get to where they can affect your analysis and synthesis, otherwise until you see them and understand them. So I think that's what he's trying to do here. It's what gets into your orientation, into your brain that counts.
Let's also point out something else. Our orientation can actually act as a filter, preventing us from seeing things that are unfolding in front.
Absolutely. That's the arrow going back the other way.
That's it.
Absolutely.
Right. So the implicit guidance and control pathway that moves from orient back to observe can be our ego. It could be our default mode of operating. It could be our perception of reality that emerges from our orientation. And these things actually can filter what we see on the external world. And there's other sayings out there, we only see what we expect to see.
Incestuous amplification, as Chuck Spinney called it.
Right.
Which has also made it into the business press. I've noticed in a couple of places.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But again, this connects back to what researchers are identifying through neuroscience and biology. And that is, we do have something known as a reticular activating system or filtering system that prevents us from seeing things. Something else, when we talk about echo chambers and we talk about like flow systems being in an oxbow lake, you actually take actions onto the world so you can minimize surprise, minimize that new information coming in.
One of the things, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. Moose, thoughts on this? Because when I saw this, I'm like, this is something we need to talk about. There's a reason that Boyd shifted this from 87 to 96.
Well, I also think it pulls away from the linear trap that a lot of people fall into.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. And so I think on the, I think it's coming up on maybe the next chart or the chart after that. Now it's Yeah.
I mean,
All right,
'cause when
this one right here.
real quick though, when you talk to most people, you always hear them say, then I moved to the orient phase. Like, I mean, they're still talking about tumbling around aimlessly, and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that's another good reason why it pays to try to understand where Boyd was going with this chart and not just stick with the other one because it's simple. The circular process is there as part of a learning process, and it's because you are probing and testing, and you're learning from the probing and testing. All right, that's fine, but it also questions, all right, what are you going to probe and test? You need an intuitive feel for for that. You can only send so many patrols out, for example, you can only do reconnaissance and force in so many different directions at any given time, usually one. So which one's it going to be? And that's where that implicit part comes in. The commander is going through all these mental models in his head, and all of a sudden, okay, we're going to go this way. I want you to probe that way, go this far, and do this, and we're going to watch, see what happens, kind of a thing, as opposed to all the other possible directions they can go in.
So guys, I want to do this. I want to defend bad OODA for a second, and do the simple observe, orient, decide, act, the 4-step process. And here's why I want to do it. Many people use it. It is useful in a clear domain where the relationship between cause and effect, where there's nothing changing in the world, right? Where it's highly predictable. That is a good place to use bad OODA. The problem with that is I don't know of any place, any context where we know the relationship between cause and effect with a high degree of certainty anymore.
Particularly if there's thinking opponents involved.
Right.
When things get so clear, you can use the bad OODA. Alarm bells ought to just be going off all in your in the back of your mind.
And going back to Mark brought this warning up. If you're learning I hate to call it the real OODA loop, we'll call it that. It fits in all domains. I'm using Cynefin framework here: clear, complicated, complex, chaotic.
It's a good framework. Yeah.
And that's important because we do not live in a world where the relationship between cause and effect is known all the time. Large language models are trying to replicate bad OODA loop, and so it's a little bit of agentic AI. And what that means is they're using a bad model. Not a bad model. They're using a model designed for a certain context in the wrong context. That means they're going to go into disorder. They're going to be in confusion. What we suggest, and this is what's happening on our podcast and a lot of our episodes, is the connection to the nonlinear dynamic world of John Boyd's work, actually, and what people are seeing in complex adaptive systems thinking, cybernetics, and so forth, is that the way we're going to scale AI, it's going to look more like Boyd's real OODA loop. And this is critically important because if you understand that your teams are complex adaptive systems, and we talked about this earlier about building that implicit guidance control up for teaming skills, the reason you're doing that is so you can deal with more complexity, right? And if you understand Boyd's OODA loop sketch and his work and all that, you can deal with more complexity. Bottom line right there, right? So again, kind of self-serving here, Chet, but please continue. I'm sorry to jump in there and get you.
No, that was quite good. So if you look at it over here, you can see Boyd's still thinking about this stuff because he says, notice how orientation shapes. All right, you can see all that. Also, how the entire loop, not just orientation. What does he mean by that? Entire loop, not just, does he mean that the entire loop is an ongoing many-sided implicit ... and so is orientation. In other words, the loop is this, but so is orientation. In other words, orientation is, but it's not the only one. Go
ahead, finish, Chet. Yeah.
It could mean that the entire loop is a process, but just orientation is not. You see, it could be read either way, and I don't know where Boyd was in this when he finally had to hang it up.
This is what I run into a lot. I tell people, there's orientation, the noun, and orientation, the verb.
Yep.
And knowing
the verb. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or orient the verb, and
you're right.
knowing the difference between the two, because one of the ways that I think about the sketch is that and this kind of was my thought after talking to Chuck for 3 hours, Chuck Spinney.
Oh God. My condolences to you both.
Well, it would have gone on longer had his wife not intervened and said, Chuck, we got to go to dinner. You got to hang up the phone.
Yeah, I'm going to have to leave here in about 7 or 8 minutes, by the way, take my wife. So anyway.
I'll leave it with this thought, Chet, is that the orientation, the noun, orientation, the verb, I guess the way that after talking with Chuck and thinking about it more, and I always kind of felt this, that he described OODA loop sketch to me as an illustrative abstraction of essentially how orientation functions, and our orientation is our repository of all of those things. Our being, it's who we are, it's our everything. And I think that that's where people screw up with back to the linear OODA folks. They only think of orient the verb. They don't think of orientation. Or OODA loop sketch being sort of an illustration of how our orientation functions. And then when you do what Chuck has done, and what Ponch likes to point out too with the Markov blanket and the boundary, is that then you can really start to see how this is actually your orientation functioning within your reality.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, and I think that's
separate topic. I started writing on how Ayn Rand. We were watching something about her, and there's a lot of things that she says that are pretty interesting, and her novels are great. But one of the things that she was saying, like she was insistent on, was that all reality is objective. Which, how can that even be?
That's why our philosophy is called objectivism.
I got it. Yeah, that's why it's called objectivism. But when you think about all the things that make up your orientation, how in the world could you ever see reality as something objective? Because it's a controlled hallucination of what we think we see. That's a very subjective thing, not objective.
Yeah, it may well be objective, but you're not. What goes on inside your brain is So it's sort of like people are talking about: do we live in a multiverse, and are we a simulation, and all that? And my question is, what difference would it make? What would you do differently if you knew we were living in a simulation? Maybe I enjoyed the Matrix movies too, but we don't have the red pill and blue pill, whatever. So what difference does it make? So I
don't know. We do. We have understanding OODA linearly, or understanding OODA in this respect. This is more the red
touche.
pill.
Well done. Well spoken. And now this is interesting, because how can key statements and related insights be open? A statement is a statement; it sits there. But he clearly is on to something here. But if you start taking it apart, the OODA loop sketch, all that it does is it feeds information in stuff and selects actions from the key statements. In other words, the related insights, the OODA loop is part of that. So he's on to something here, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. And I think what he's really saying is that this is my snowmobile, Model A, and I have to hang it up at this point for a variety of reasons. So you guys take it from there. In other words, this whole thing, the statements need to be looked at and thought about, and the insights need to be thought, like we were just doing here. What does that just mean? Does it make any difference if you interpret it two different ways? There's some insights to be gained. And so I think that's the kind of thing he was driving, because, he hated dogma. Yeah. He didn't like doctrine because it had a tendency to turn into dogma. And Chuck had warned him, if you draw an OODA loop sketch, it's going to turn into dogma. And I think that's kind of what he's warning people about, which is why I think that the people that are going on with new OODA loop diagrams and things like that and playing with it are doing exactly what they should be doing. Whether they come up with anything useful or not, that's we'll have to see. But that's the direction that things should be going in.
What was the published? Remind me again the published date of this, or when he finished this before he passed.
Well, there were two: June 1935. June 1995, and the final version was January 1996. And he died March 97.
Yeah,
about the time that his cancer really came charging back. Yeah. He started to get really weak and not really interested in doing very much else. So,
hey, Chet, any chance there's a specific date in June? I'm just out of curiosity. Do you know?
No, I don't. Well, let's say that. Hold on just a minute. I might have put that into on the back page of the Essence of Winning and Losing.
I mean, the reality is, while Chet's looking that up, I mean, when we're telling listeners and people that we work with, you could take this is the distillation of everything that John Boyd did. And if if you skip destruction creation, you skip patterns and patterns of conflict, you skip all the other briefings, you're really screwing yourself over, though. You're going to have a hard time trying to understand this very simple 5 or 6 page brief.
He called it the big squeeze. Yeah, it says here the first version carried the date 28 June 1995, and the last appeared sometime in January 1996.
Okay,
so,
I was asking because going back to your point about a simulation, if it was 624, then we'd be in trouble. But that's another. All right. That'll make more sense in the future episodes. I promise you.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Yeah. So.
All right, guys. I'm gonna have to break off from here. I apologize. Anytime you want to get together again, let me know.
No, Chet, so important.
Things start getting slow.
Yeah, it's so important because I think it helps drive the point home with the bad Boyd crowd, which unfortunately, as we said, is pervasive. If you're competing truly and you're looking to become more collaborative, more cohesive with your group, you have to understand OODA in these terms. You have to understand what Boyd's actually talking about, not what he's reduced to.
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly right. Why is he doing all this? What's the purpose? Now, what's interesting is he started using. I asked Chuck, when did he use the term OODA loop? Chuck wasn't sure, but he said he started using the terms observe, orient, decide, and act when he was chief of development plans in the Air Force. And
was that after Thailand? Was that after
before Thailand?
Oh, it was before Thailand.
I believe. I had left the Pentagon by then, gone up to work for the agency, and then went out to California to work for Northrop. So I'm not, but I met him in his office as chief of development plans when Paul Berenson, who was head of the office at that time, took us down to meet John Boyd. So we all got up. We knew who he was from the EM thing. But that was so we met him, this tall guy, Air Force Colonel. Hi, how you doing? That was about that. But I've forgotten where we're going with all of this. But that was.
Well, no, we were just saying.
Yeah,
about
he was using.
Yeah.
He was using those 4 words. But when he decided to use them to describe first how he did air-to-air combat, and then how you got inside an opponent's OODA loop and all that kind of good stuff. All that apparently came out after he retired when he was doing the little paper for NASA that we have posted as New Conception for Air-to-Air Combat, also known as the Fast Transients paper. Because if you look at that near the end of it, he's clearly talking about what later became operating inside the OODA loop. And then when he went to patterns of conflict right after that, right at the front of it, he kind of took some charts from New Conception Air-to-Air Combat, and that becomes the point of departure for patterns of conflict. And if you read that, now he is using the term operating inside the OODA loop. And I have a version of that from September 1981 that uses the expression operating inside the OODA loop.
And you talked about, you have on Slightly East of New, you have Chuck's evolution of OODA.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a time where it was ODA.
Yes, ODA. And Chuck said, and thinking about it, he's talking with Ray Leopold, who was there at the time. They were both captains, I think, working for Boyd. And he said it started out with observe, decide, and act. And they were trying to figure out something other than mission areas like close air support or battlefield air interdiction, something other than that. He said the reason those weren't useful for developing development plans was you can do close air support with any airplane. B-52s often do it, for example. So when you try to develop what kind of new airplane, you really need to get more into what it is, what are they actually doing? And that's where they were very high level stuff. Well, hard work and systems can observe, they can help make decisions. Thinking of Task Force Alpha there, where they were, listening to monkey, putting sensors out into the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and monkeys would set them off and they would bomb and all kind of stuff. The Vietnamese quickly discovered what was going on, and so they would set it up so they could set them off remotely to attract the bombing in that area while they were going somewhere else, and all that kind of stuff. And then act, and then they broke those down. But where he then took those categories and got them over into how you operate in a conflict situation, somewhere in that period between 1975 and about 1977, 1978, when he really started working big time on patterns of conflict, is where that change happened.
Well, Chet, we're honored to say that we're honored to have you as a friend and a teacher, and as we continue to develop these ideas would be a gross understatement, but we really appreciate you coming on for your 3rd time. You're now in the 3-timers club of No Way Out.
Well, thank you very much. The honor and privilege is all mine. I can assure you. These are a lot of fun, and I learn a lot every time we do them. So, thank you very much.
We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Chet.
We will
Thank you,
talk
Chet.
to you later. Bye bye.